Okay, good morning. Today is day 27 of Bible in 90 Days, or What's in the Bible, where we're reading through the entire Bible just to summarize the Bible and see what the gist of the story is. So imagine if somebody came to you who had never read the Bible, didn't know anything about the Bible, came to you and said, what's in the Bible? What does the Bible talk about? What is the story of the Bible? So that's probably, the main reason for doing what we're doing, just to know, what the Bible talks about. Just if somebody also asked you, what's that movie about, or what's that book about, or whatever else, you'd be able to give them a little bit of a summary of what he says. So, day 27, 2 Kings. We're reading 2 Kings chapter 5 all the way to 15. As I had said, that we're now in the period of Israel and Judah, where there were kings that were reigning over them, and what these kings did and how they conducted their affairs. This is obviously after many years of the Israel had asked for a king, after the judges and after Samuel and after Joshua and after Moses and everything else that has happened in the history of the Israelites so far. So yesterday we're talking about the major prophets that kind of came up in the same time as as these kings, for example, Elijah and Elisha, who, although the kings who were there were supposed to lead the people correctly and teach them the commandments of God, etc., some of them were going astray, but God still had these prophets that were still talking about exactly what he wanted them to do. So we just continue. We're in the story of Elisha at the moment, who kind of took over from Elijah when Elijah was taken up to heaven. Right, so 2 Kings 5, we hear about Naaman, the commander of the army of Syria, or Aram, who was healed of his leprosy by Elisha. He was simply told to go and wash in the Jordan River 5 times. So there's a really interesting story there about the conversations that they had and how Naaman knew about Elisha and ended up getting healed. At this point, Elisha actually tells Naaman that he didn't want any money or any reward for healing them of his leprosy, and he let him go. But Gehazi, Elisha's servant, saw this as an opportunity to run after Naaman and say, oh, by the way, we actually need the money now, etc., etc. So he takes the money from Naaman, and Elisha knows about this, and obviously the curse of the leprosy is now put on Gehazi and his family. 2 Kings chapter 6, we hear more about Elisha's miracles. So these guys were really working in the miracles, whether it was provision or healing or whatever it could have been that the people really needed, at that time. They were being given that. So we hear that at one point he made an axe head float. It had actually sunk and it was borrowed or whatever, so he then just threw a piece of wood in there and it came back to the surface. He had the word of knowledge, where he could know exactly what the king of Syria was saying in his bedroom, apparently. So there was nothing that was hidden to Elisha. We then hear that after some things that happened, there was some peace between Aram or Syria and Israel, for a little while. Then after a while, there was another war again, but Samaria was besieged. Samaria was basically an area in Israel. So sometimes when you say Samaria, it's actually just talking about Israel. Samaria was besieged until there was a great famine. So what besieging meant is, imagine you had a city and it had walls around it, right? That's the city. Then an army comes and surrounds the whole city, right? So that nobody can come out of the city and nobody can go into the city. And it was maybe a patient tactic. So they would wait there until you eat up all the food in the city. Then you had no more food until people start to starve. Then they would be so weak that they would then be captured or they would surrender, whatever. So at this time, Samaria is actually besieged. And there was a great, famine, obviously. The king then blames Elisha for this and tries to go and kill him. 2 Kings 7, Elisha prophesies that the situation, would change overnight in 24 hours, i.e. they would go from so much famine and hunger and everything else, and tomorrow there'd be an abundance, of food, which, the aide to the king didn't believe, and as a result, things didn't go well, for him. So how it actually happened was God came into the camp of the Syrians and did something in there, and they were all confused and they ran away. So they left all their donkeys, their food, their provisions there. Then we hear about some 4 lepers that then go to the camp of the Syrians, and they see this, and obviously they take the gold, etc., etc. Then they tell the people in Samaria, and the people in Samaria then come out and see all of this, and they start to to eat. So what Elisha had said, that the situation would change within 24 hours or the very next day or whatever, actually came to pass. 2 Kings 8, we have the woman from Shunem. The woman from Shunem, we heard about her yesterday, who had taken care of Elisha. She gets her stuff restored to her because she had left for a while because of the famine, but now she's back, but she didn't have a land, so she's given her land back and it's restored to her. We then hear Elisha prophesying about a guy called Hazael, who would then kill a guy called Ben-Hadad, who was the current king of Syria at that time. Whilst Joram was the king of Israel, we hear about Jehoram, who was reigning in Judah, and he reigned in sin. So I don't want you to get too worried about the names Jehoram, Jehoash, Jehoash, whatever. They're really hard to say, the names, and I'm probably butchering them right now. But it's just important for the sake of the chronology. Okay, this was happening here, this was happening here. So don't get too, worried about the, the names for now. However, it says, even though Jehoram was reigning, in sin, i.e. worshipping idols, not following God's command, God, because of his covenant with Judah, still did not destroy them. So he had said, there'll always be a king there. He would not make a complete end of them. So even though they were going against the covenant, he still he still didn't destroy them. We hear about Edom, which was basically Esau's nation, revolting against Judah, and the following wars that took place. We have another king called Ahaziah, who reigns over Judah. He also reigned in sin. Then Ahaziah and Joram, these two kings, so one king from Israel, another king from from Judah, they fight against Hazael, the king of Syria, but Joram was injured in that war. Then Ahaziah visits him later on. 2 Kings chapter 9, we have a guy called Jehu, who is anointed to be the next king. Then he goes ahead and kills Joram and Ahaziah, and this was actually a prophecy that had been already told, that had been foretold, that certain members of that family would die. We also hear about the killing of Jezebel at this point. 2 Kings 10, we hear the killing of all the sons of Ahab, which is just another prophecy that was being fulfilled. Then Jehu also then killed all the relatives of King Ahaziah and Ahab. Then Jehu, so he's pretty much doing like a cleanup at this point of Israel and everything that's happening. By a cunning plan, he manages to kill all the prophets and the worshippers of of Baal. But then you would think, after all of this and how God had helped Jehu to do all of this and had anointed him, he would actually follow God. But he didn't. He actually continued to worship other idols. So at this point, we hear that God now starts to trim or to remove parts of Israel, because if you remember, this was their land, but now God was beginning to take it away from them because of such the sinful state of Israel at that point. We then hear about the death of Jehu, and he was succeeded by a guy called Jehoahaz. 2 Kings 11, Athaliah kills the entire royal family, and she then becomes the ruler or the queen. But there was one son who was spared. His name was Joash. He was hidden away actually by his sister, and he was raised up by a priest called Jehoiada. Joash, when he was old enough, he was made the king, and they found Athaliah and killed her. Then they started another cleanup of Israel. So in 2 Kings 12, we hear about Joash's reforms and how he followed God and how he repaired the temple. Then at one point, a guy called Hazael comes again to make war against Joash, but he pays him off for the sake of peace. Then we hear that Joash, his end, he was killed by his servants, and his son called Amaziah succeeded him. 2 Kings chapter 13, Jehoahaz's reign was in sin in Israel, and we hear about the constant wars that were happening as a result of this. And there's a really interesting, well, not interesting, but sobering point that says the army was depleted to less than 50 horses and 10,000 foot soldiers. Now, if you remember the last time David had done a census sometime in, I think, 2 Samuel, I think there was about 600,000, warriors that were ready for war. So to go from that to only about 15,000 kind of tells you the amount of wars that were happening and how the army was getting, defeated. We hear about the death of Jehoahaz and his succession by Joash. Joash also reigned in sin, and then he died. Then Jeroboam took over. We then hear a conversation between Elisha just before he died, the conversation that he has with King Joash about defeating the Syrians. We then hear about the death eventually of Elisha, but the miracle still continued, because there was a story that even though Elisha was dead and his bones were there was this guy who was being carted off from wherever, and by mistake he fell onto Elisha's bones. But just the fact that he fell onto Elisha's bones, he resurrected, to life. We then hear about the oppression from King Hazael, the king of Syria, but it was actually met, with compassion from God. So although they were being oppressed by King Hazael, you would think God would allow it to continue happening because of the sin that was happening. But it actually says that God here responds, with compassion. Then verse 23, 2 Kings 13, verse 23 tells us why. It says, "But the Lord was gracious to them and had compassion on them. He turned towards them because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and would not destroy them, nor has he banished them from his presence until now." So you can see the strength of the covenant of Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac, and how God kept his promises from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before the Israelites are in this point. So before Abraham even had a son, he had already been told about all these things that were gonna happen. So here that some land is actually taken back, from Hazael after Hazael's death. 2 Kings chapter 14, Amaziah, we had about a king called Amaziah's reign in Judah, and he was actually a good king. So it says he reigned like Asa, and like David, he read and followed the law. So this is one of the first time we actually hear about the reading of the law that Moses had been given, and the book of law that would be given to the kings every time they started their reign. We hear that later on Amaziah picks a fight with Israel, then he loses that fight. Then Jehoash, king of Israel, died at that point and is succeeded by Jeroboam. So at this point, actually in 2 Kings 14, there's a bit of a mishmash of the order, because sometimes it talks about one king and goes all the way, then you think the story is actually moving forward, then it switches back again to say, okay, in the 14th year of that king in Judah, so if you actually concentrate and just kind of write it down as you go, you can actually manage to see the chronological order. But don't be too worried about that at the moment. What you need to understand at the moment as we're reading through is there was a bunch of kings, all right? They reigned in Israel. Some of them also reigned in Judah, because remember, as we talked about I think a few days ago, that there was a split in the kingdom at one point. So all we are getting told here is how these kings reigned, and what was happening with the prophets, or what was happening in Israel, and what was also happening in Judah. That is like the big idea, to pick up from these things. So don't get too bogged down, in the detail. So we hear about the death of Amaziah, and he was succeeded by a guy called Azariah. We hear that Jeroboam was an evil king, but he was still helped by God because of the covenant that we have already spoken about. Then we hear a mention about Jonah, a prophet that we're going to hear about and read about much later on. So this period of time when the kings were there, the prophets were being sent as messengers from God to say what God wanted to do, or what he wanted Israel to do, and how he was rebuking and correcting all these kings. So the prophets, they play a huge part in the history of Israel, just as the kings do, just as the judges do, just as Joshua did, and just as Moses did, as well as the Levite priests. So there's actually a huge section after we get through this that is dedicated to the prophets, that way in Israel. 2 Kings 15, the last chapter of today, we hear about Azariah's reign and how he was later struck with leprosy, and his son Jotham was actually taking care of business during that time. So he was reigning in Judah at this point. We hear about the reign of Zechariah and sin, how he was reigning in sin, and his eventual murder. And all of these things, it keeps telling us and reminding us that these things would happen according to the foretelling of God, that God would say, okay, Jehu would have 4 kings after him, or Solomon would have this many, or that king would have that many. It was things that God had already foretold as to who was going to be king, at what point. So we then hear about a bunch of other sinful kings, is Israel, who just worshipped idols, who led Israel astray, until we get to a guy called Jotham, who was actually a good king who followed after God. We hear then about the death of Jotham, who was then succeeded by a guy called Ahaz. Then at this point, we hear that God begins to destroy parts of Judah. A few chapters before, he started destroying parts of Israel, but now, even in Judah, where there was this covenant that nothing would happen, he then starts to destroy parts of Judah because of the wickedness and the sinfulness that was going on there. So yes, we continue 2 Kings 15. We just continue, then we get into, I think, First Chronicles, Second Chronicles, and all the way as we continue. So I hope that's helpful. I just like getting this information in. Although I've done it before, it's actually good for me as well, just to recite it for myself, and it helps me remember more about what actually happened. And sometimes it's not just about the detail, like, oh, let's just hear the detail. How does that even apply to us today? How it applies to us today is we can see how God dealt with the nation. We can see how God dealt with people, how he dealt with kings, how he dealt with suffering, how he dealt with war, with death, etc. And those things, when we see the character of God and how he worked through these people and regular people and people just like us, we can use that to apply to our lives, and it will help us to interpret and understand when we start reading, the New Testament. So I will see you guys tomorrow.